Do you avoid pre-washing your fabric for fear of a mess like this? This is a real photo, folks, of quilting fabric that came out of my washer. Or have you ever held your breath and hoped for the best the first time you had to wash a cherished quilt, worried that the colors might bleed? What's the truth and what's just habit or myth? If you've heard so many conflicting opinions that you're not even sure what to believe, stick around. Because today we're unpacking 7 of the biggest myths about pre-washing quilting fabric, and I'll show you real-life examples to help you decide what's best for your quilts. Hi, I'm Beth Ann Williams. I'm probably best known for my Celtic-style quilts, but I've been teaching various quilt methods since 1997, and I've seen this question come up time and again. So let's dive into these 7 common myths, the truths behind them, and how that might affect your choices. Myth number 1, pre-washing is a must for every quilter. The truth? Pre-washing your quilt fabric isn't a universal rule. In my view, it's a personal decision based on 3 main factors: the kind of project you're making, the fabrics you're using, and how the finished quilt will be used. If you're making something that will never be laundered, there may be no need to pre-wash. But if you're making a quilt that will be heavily used and laundered, potential shrinkage of the fabrics might make pre-washing a better choice. A quick note, I hope you like kitties. You're going to see quite a bit of my cats today since my human family is reluctant to appear on camera. Back to business. Check out these 4 fabrics before washing, all layered and trimmed at the same time to the exact same size. And check them out after washing. They did not shrink at the same rate. The batik fabric doesn't seem to have shrunk at all. But the ones that did shrink not only shrank, but they shrank unevenly, more in one direction than the other. That kind of uneven shrinkage could cause weird puckering or distortion in a finished quilt. And if you had fabric that was not washed mixed with fabric that was washed, you could have all kinds of crazy different rates of shrinkage when you did eventually wash that finished quilt. Case closed? Actually, no. There are times when skipping pre-washing might make more sense. Stay tuned. We'll discuss this in more detail. Myth number 2, pre-washing takes too much time. The truth: yes, pre-washing adds steps to your process, but can also save you time in the long run and heartache too. But first, let's look at the very real potential downside of pre-washing. Remember this wrinkled, stringy mess? This is some fabric that I washed in my washer without doing anything to the raw edges of the fabric. Yuck. This is something that you want to avoid. There are 2 things that can help you do just that. The first is to think about those raw edges. Some folks like to wash their fabric in mesh bags or lingerie bags, especially Precuts, while others prefer to zigzag or overlock or serge over the raw edges of the fabric to help prevent them from fraying in the washer. But my favorite technique is to use pinking shears or a rotary cutter with a pinking blade or a wave blade to trim the cut edges of the fabric before washing. This almost completely eliminates fraying. My second tip: as you pull each fabric out of the washer, take the time to gently pull on it, especially along the edges, to smooth it out. If the fabric goes into the dryer a wrinkly mess, it is definitely going to come out a wrinkly mess. But if you put it in smooth, it is much more likely to come out nice and smooth with minimal wrinkles. A couple of side notes. When I'm pre-washing my fabric, I either skip the detergent or I use the same gentle dye-free detergent for sensitive skin that we use for all of our regular laundry. Synthrapol can be another great choice, as it is a surfactant that traps any stray dye molecules, but I find it a little pricey for the sheer volume of fabric that I go through. I also avoid using dryer sheets or fabric softener in the dryer when I pre-wash my fabric, as I don't want to add any chemicals back into the fabric. If you find that your fabric is coming out of the dryer full of static electricity, try drying it for a shorter time and with less heat. Finally, I avoid a lot of extra ironing by pulling my fabric out of the dryer while it is still warm, smoothing it out with my hands, and folding it the way that I would for rotary cutting. Nice and flat. Myth number 3. Unwashed fabric is always easier to work with. Truth? Not necessarily. Most fabrics have been treated with a variety of chemical finishes, from anti-wrinkle to anti-fading. As long as both the quilt maker and the quilt recipients have no sensitivity issues, these finishes can be great, especially if you're making quilts for display. But what can be deceiving is the type and amount of industrial sizing that has been added to the fabric. One purpose of this sizing is to help the fabric wrap smoothly around the bolt and stay looking nice and crisp without fading as it is displayed in the store. But some bargain fabrics sold as quilting weight cottons have so much sizing that they feel much crisper between your fingers and more substantial and higher quality than they actually are. And when you mix these fabrics with higher quality quilting weight cottons in a quilt that's actually going to be used and laundered, the sizing eventually washes out. And you might find, as I did with this quilt that I made back in the 1990s, that that particular fabric wears out much more quickly than the others, shortening the life of the quilt. I don't know about you, but I would rather find out about a flimsy fabric ahead of time. Another note about sizing and finishes: some quilters find that they prefer working with unwashed fabric because the fabric feels crisper and easier to handle. If that's you, you might consider spray starching your fabric after washing, or using a starch alternative such as Mary Ellen's Best Pressed, either straight from the original bottle or in a mister, which is what I prefer. Starch is usually the more affordable option, but it does have potential downsides. Some starches can leave white flakes and an eventual buildup on your iron and on your ironing surface. And depending on where you live, you need to be aware of storing fabric or quilts that have been starched and stored without washing out the starch, because over time, the starch can attract insects like silverfish. Personally, I prefer a light misting of Mary Ellen's Best Press, a starch alternative, if I need to give the fabric a little more body. I don't do that very often, but it's an option. I do like to use it if I have a stubborn wrinkle or crease in the fabric after it has come out of the dryer. A light, just a light, mist of Best Press releases the creases and makes it easy to get a nice flat finish with a dry iron. If you'd like to avoid using starch, use good quality quilting weight cotton fabric. Make sure your rotary cutter is nice and sharp so it's not pulling on the fabric. Make sure you're not pulling on the fabric as you're sewing the pieces together. And don't stretch or distort the fabric by pressing on the bias. Instead, press with the grain of the fabric. But always use whatever works best for you. So if you find a starch or starch alternative helpful, go for it. But on a related note, sizing and finishes may impede bonding if you're glue basting or using fusible adhesives like Steam-A-Seam or Wonder Under or Heat and Bond or any similar products, as I did on this quilt. you might consider pre-washing or testing to see if they'll work. Myth number 4. High-quality fabric doesn't need pre-washing. The truth? Even premium quilting cottons can shrink and or release excess dye. In fact, some of the most vibrant, richly saturated fabrics may shed dye regardless of how expensive the fabric was. This kind of issue becomes most noticeable when you combine very light and very saturated or dark fabrics in the same quilt. For example, let's compare 2 of the quilts we use on our bed. For this version of my Easy Pieces quilt, all of the K-facet fabrics are richly saturated and any color bleed would be hard to spot. But for my version of the Meadowland quilt, the bright white spaces would be irresistible for any excess dye that might be floating around in the wash water. The same goes for this vibrant baby quilt. All those white spots would be a dye magnet for any color floating off any of those bright colored fabrics. Now, unlike fabric with unstable dyes, such as some hand-dyed fabric, most high-quality quilting cottons are not really bleeding. The color isn't fading. It's just that when the fabric was manufactured, the dye bath used to give that fabric its rich, intense color was so concentrated that not only did the dye molecules bond with the fabric, but excess dye molecules were left sitting on top of the fabric, ready to float away later. That's why color fastness tests, like soaking a small swatch in a glass of warm water, can be a helpful way to test for unstable dyes or excess dye. Just give it 15-20 minutes at the minimum and give it a few stirs with a chopstick or something. Watch to see if you can see any whisper of dye coming off the fabric. You can use Retayne to set any unstable dyes and Synthrapol to remove any excess dye. Now, some folks like to add salt or add vinegar to their wash water to fix unstable dyes, but that has not worked well for me when I tested it. It just makes me crave potato chips. Since I prefer to wash all my quilting cottons, I separate my fabric into color and/or value families, similar to sorting my wash into lights, mediums, and darks. I also drop at least 1 color catcher sheet into the washer with each load of fabric, and I'm usually doing about a maximum of 6 yards, sometimes less, in my large top-loading washer. I might use more than 1 color catcher sheet if it's a very large load, or if I have some fabric I'm concerned about. Now, there are other brands that do the same thing. This is just the brand that my local store carries. Right out of the box, the sheets are a nice bright white. But here's some used ones. Check out all that color. If I have a sheet come out of the washer just as white as it went in, I let it dry and use it again. But if it has a lot of color, I'll wash that fabric again with a new color catcher, or maybe more than one if it's a lot of color. And just to be on the safe side, I always include 1 or more color catcher sheets the first time or two that I wash any finished quilt. Which leads us to myth number 5. Pre-washing eliminates all risk of shrinking or bleeding. The truth? Pre-washing reduces risk, but it's not foolproof. As careful as I am, I once had a quilt with all pre-washed fabrics nearly ruined the night before I had to send it to my then publisher for professional photography. I didn't notice until after the quilt had been not only washed in the washer, but dried in the dryer, that several of the red fabrics had created a very noticeable pink halo around the knotwork. I didn't take any photos at the time, so I'm highlighting with yellow the areas where the color bleeding happened. Happily, I got the stains out in time to mail my quilt, but it was a close thing and very stressful. What ended up working for me was using a foam brush to saturate the affected area with Synthrapol and kind of rub it in a little bit. Synthrapol, remember, is a detergent and surfactant that helps trap and remove excess dye. And then I rewashed the entire quilt again, adding the recommended amount of Synthrapol in the washer with the wash water in addition to the Synthrapol that we'd rubbed into the quilt. It was nerve-wracking, but I got the stains out. Another side note, if you started quilting some decades ago, you might know that there were times when we washed our battings as well as our fabric. But battings have come a long, long way, and I haven't washed a batting in years. I would only do so now if the manufacturer of that particular batting specified on the packaging that it was necessary or recommended it for some specific reason. Okay, back to fabric. Myth 5, Part 2. This is related. If I want my quilt to have that lovely crinkly texture after washing the finished quilt, I should avoid pre-washing my fabric. The truth? I find that lovely crinkle has as much to do with the type of batting that you use and the density of the quilting, particularly machine quilting. Here's a close-up of a quilt with all pre-washed fabrics after quilting but before washing. As you can see, the surface is nice and smooth. And here it is after just one wash. Ronan will tell you that there's plenty of comfy, crinkly texture in this quilt, and it will only increase with every wash. However, it is true that 100% cotton batting will tend to have a little bit more crinkle than a quilt with a cotton poly blend batting. Also, depending on the density of the quilting, it is normal to expect a finished bed-size quilt to shrink 2 to 4 inches just from the way the quilting compresses the fabric. The most extreme examples of this usually happen with dense custom quilting or dense free motion quilting and then washing the finished quilt. It's hard to tell in this photo, but I quilted this particular quilt so heavily that it actually lost 7 inches in both length and width, despite using all pre-washed fabrics and a cotton poly blend batting. Even pre-washed quilts will crinkle when the finished quilt is washed, especially with a cotton batting. Myth number 6, precuts cannot be pre-washed. The truth? Precuts like jelly rolls, mini charms, charm packs, and layer cakes are notoriously tricky to pre-wash. They're small, often fray easily, especially how the edges were treated. Some have pinked edges, some do not. And depending on the pattern that you're using, you often can't afford to lose even 1/8 of an inch to shrinkage. My personal take on precuts, I love a good fat quarter bundle, and I prefer to wash fat quarters just as I do yardage. When it comes to charm squares, those 5-inch squares, if I plan to mix them with other pre-wash yardage or scraps from my collection, I do wash them, but only if the edges were pinked. If the edges are not pinked, I do not wash them because it's going to be a stringy mess. Sometimes I will wash a layer cake, and that's a package of 10-inch. These have not been ironed. I took them out of the dryer while they were still a little warm and smoothed them out with my hand. Also, even though the layer cakes with pinked edges do wash well, I still only wash them if the measurements in the pattern allow for trimming. Because in this case, and this was good quality fabric, the fabric shrank only about 1/8 of an inch in one direction, but almost 5/8 of an inch in the other. When it comes to mini charms and jelly rolls, both about 2.5 inches wide, I don't pre-wash, but I avoid mixing washed and unwashed fabric in the same quilt. I'm also a little more likely to choose batik 2.5 inch strips when I have the choice because they're less prone to shrinkage because they are already heat processed during production. I still use color catcher sheets though. When skipping pre-washing, I try to stick with fabrics from the same manufacturer so that any shrinkage will be more likely to be consistent, and I use a color catcher sheet when washing the finished quilt. Which brings us to myth number 7. If insert famous quilter doesn't pre-wash, I don't need to either. And the truth? Many popular designers never pre-wash. And for good reason. They're usually working with brand new, high quality fabric from the same collection, from the same manufacturer, and on projects intended for quick use and display. This can also be true for filmed quilt tutorials, like these on YouTube, and shop samples. But what if you're using fabric from multiple sources? And I admit I'm an equal opportunity shopper if the color and pattern is pretty enough. This monochromatic fabric pull has quilt shop fabric, some chain store fabric, thrifted fabric, and fabric I inherited from Grandma Baldwin. Or what if you like to combine batik fabrics with non-batik quilting weight cottons, like I did in this quilt? Remember, they shrink at different rates. Or what if you're using high contrasting fabrics, like this very pastel blue that's almost white and the very dark, deep, rich navy blues? Or if, like me, you have a fabric collection that spans decades. Finally, if your quilt is going to be used and loved and washed, pre-washing might still make the most sense. So what do I recommend as a longtime quilter? Here are my suggestions. And please note, I'm saying suggestions, not rules. They're not rules. It's not the quilt police. They're just suggestions. Okay? Display quilts or wall hangings that won't need to be laundered? Probably okay to skip it. Are you buying all the fabric at the same time from the same manufacturer, and you're planning on either not washing or only washing the finished quilt in cold water? Probably okay to skip it, although you might want to test any suspect fabrics for color fastness. And I do recommend color catcher sheets too. I actually did pre-wash this fabric. Are you using small precuts? Consider skipping. Make sure any additional fabrics that you use are also unwashed. And, if applicable, launder the finished quilt on cold with a color catcher. Now, what if you're mixing fabric from multiple manufacturers? Mixing fabrics from multiple sources? Mixing fabrics collected over time? Making everyday use quilts that might need more frequent laundering? Making quilts that might be gifted to folks who may not be familiar with how to care for quilts? In all these cases, I definitely prefer to pre-wash. As I said earlier, the ultimate goal is to make an informed decision that works with your quilting style and your preferences, not to follow a rule just because it's what someone else says or does. The decision is completely up to you, and if you are happy with the results that you're getting right now, you're making the right decision for yourself. And remember, you don't have to pick one side forever. My approach has definitely evolved over time, and yours might too, and that's okay. Let's keep the conversation going. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your best tips, tricks, even horror stories in the comments, anything that might have surprised you, and let's help each other make more informed, confident choices. Happy quilting!